Hare Krishna. Today we're continuing with the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami. We're on chapter 8, which is entitled Planting the Seed, and that is also the title of this second volume. I just want to recap a little bit. We've gone through the journey to America in this chapter, in this book. Then Prabhupada's stay in Butler. Then when he decided to leave Butler and go to New York, this third chapter was called Struggling Alone. Then the fourth chapter, It Will Not Be Possible to Assist You. Prabhupada had dreams of having the first Radha Krishna temple in New York, and all of his attempts to get help from India failed. Then Prabhupada, realizing he was going to have to get his support from America, chapter 5 is Free to Preach. When Prabhupada broke his bonds from Dr. Mishra, he rented his own room and began holding his own classes there. Then after the theft at that room, he was invited to stay at the Bowery. From the Bowery, he had a very unfortunate situation. His roommate became mad, and he had to flee that room. Sorry. Okay. You just put it here. Just put it here. Thank you. Idhar aako, bas. Dhanyavad. Hare Krishna. Then his students, that was Mukunda and Karlapati, Michael Grant and Carl. Michael found a place for Prabhupada at 26 2nd Avenue, and it was there. Just as when you plant a seed, the first thing you have to do is you have to dig open the ground. So chapter 7 is called Breaking Ground. It was there that Prabhupada started to collect sincere followers, students. In fact, he was even able to initiate those students. And now we have here chapter 8, Planting the Seed. So we're hearing about some of these first students of Srila Prabhupada, who later became his initiated disciples. Some of them to this day are still faithfully following Srila Prabhupada, carrying out the orders that he had given them in their lifetimes. And we're starting with, now we're up to hearing about Chuck Barnett, who later became Achyutananda Swami. He was very, very instrumental in establishing Krishna consciousness here in India. He couldn't bear the separation from Srila Prabhupada when Prabhupada returned to India, 1967. So he followed him here. He spent many years here in India. Prabhupada had him stay with his godbrothers, so he learned how to speak in Bengali, also Hindi. He learned how to perform the bhajans very beautifully. And he learned about the etiquette of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And he trained us all as we came here one by one to join him in India to help with the preaching. So at that time, Charlie was just a young boy, about 18 years old. Yes, Chuck Barnett was 18 years old. And he was a flute player. He used to play the flute. He was a musician. So Chuck Barnett was 18 years old. His divorced mother had recently moved to Greenwich Village, where she was studying psychology at NYU, that's New York University. Chuck had moved out of his mother's apartment to one on 12th Street on the Lower East Side. So Greenwich Village and Lower East Side, they're right next to each other. Greenwich Village was more hip. It's where all of the bohemians and the counterculture used to meet in cafes and restaurants and different places for social exchange. And then just on the other side, on the Lower East Side, that was where the lower income people lived. It was slums, actually, Puerto Ricans, Ukrainians. There was a Jewish section, the immigrants who had come to New York. So the rent was much cheaper there. Because the rent was cheaper, it also attracted these young young counterculture. Later they were called hippies. But at this time it was young people in their 20s who had dropped out of the mainstream American culture and were looking for alternative lifestyles. He had moved to an apartment on 12th Street on the Lower East Side in the neighborhood of Allen Ginsberg and other hip poets and musicians. Allen Ginsberg, he became more or less a spokesperson for this counterculture. He was a poet at that time. He was also anti-mainstream American culture. He had a boyfriend, and a lot of the young people were influenced by him through his poetry. He used to hold be-ins all over the country, and because he had been to India, in Bengal, he had learned about the chanting of Hare Krishna. When he held these be-ins at big parks and thousands of young people would come to hear him and see him, he would chant Hare Krishna with a harmonium. So he introduced the chanting of Hare Krishna even before he met Srila Prabhupada. And therefore, when he did meet Prabhupada, he became one of Prabhupada's supporters, followers, although he couldn't follow the lifestyle, especially the four regulative principles, but he appreciated very much what Srila Prabhupada was doing for the young people in America. He meaning Charlie or Chuck, was a progressive jazz flutist who worked with several professional groups in the city. He had been practicing Hatha Yoga for 6 years. So he was 18 now. That means at a very young age 12, he began practicing yoga. And he explains in his book, I brought the book here. He wrote a beautiful book called Blazing Sadhus. Here is Achyutananda Swami. Here's Srila Prabhupada leading kirtan. And his father had given him Bhagavad-Gita when he was only 8 years old. So from a very young age, he had association with Krishna's name and Krishna's philosophy. And therefore, when Prabhupada came into his life, he very quickly took up Krishna consciousness. He had been practicing Hatha Yoga for 6 years and had recently been experimenting with LSD. So at that time, because the young people did not have proper guidance, they had not met Prabhupada yet, the status quo at that time of these young people was to seek spiritual, mystical experiences by artificial means. Although they might have been practicing Hatha Yoga, they didn't understand the purpose of yoga and the goal of yoga. And by taking hallucinatory chemicals as intoxication, they were getting some mystical out-of-the-body experiences, understanding to some degree that this world was illusory, that they did not belong here. Although they didn't know where they belonged, they didn't know who they were, they didn't know where they were going, at least they could understand that there was some alter world that this so-called mystical experience was giving them. But after the effect of the drug was over, they would come right back into their same mundane lifestyle. He would have visions of lotuses and concentric circles, but after coming down, he would become more involved than ever in sensuality. So these hallucinatory drugs such as LSD, mescaline, magic mushrooms, Prabhupada's early disciples, we all grew up with this. It was part of our culture, just like here in India, you have bidis and pan and different types of charas and what's that other thing that they grow? you buy here, bong, things like that. So those things didn't exist in America. They had another kind of intoxication in America. And we all, this is, you know, this was the intoxication that American young people took. And under the influence of these intoxicants, your vision would become all colorful and, you know, psychedelic. That's where all these psychedelic artwork came from. But when the drug effect was over, then that was all over also. You came right back to your mundane world again. So the expression later became to stay high forever. How do we stay high forever? We want to be intoxicated all the time. But that's the problem with addiction and intoxication. You have to keep taking more, to stay in that intoxicated atmosphere. So it just wasn't working. And these young people, they were looking now, although they had this intoxicating experience, it obviously wasn't the answer to life because it was over after you took the intoxication. A close friend of Chuck's had suddenly gone homosexual that summer. That was another, you know, when it comes to the four regulative principles, just like there's all types of, you know, meat, fish, eggs, all types of meats you can eat. So when it came to illicit sex, everybody was experimenting. Free love meant, didn't matter what it was. So there was experimentation going on. And when his friend had gone homosexual, Chuck became disgusted and cynical. He saw that this is not where I want to be in life. This is not the direction he wanted to go. And he became even more depressed, looking for some solutions but couldn't find them. Someone told Chuck that an Indian Swami was staying downtown on 2nd Avenue. And so he came one day in August to the window of the former Matchless Gift Store. So Prabhupada had just moved in July 1st. 1 month later, he was fortunate enough to come to the Matchless Gift Shop. Chuck, I finally found 2nd Avenue and 1st Street, and I saw through the window that there was some chanting going on inside and some people were sitting up against the wall. Beside me on the sidewalk, some middle-class people were looking in and giggling. I turned to them and with my palms folded, I asked, "Is this where a Swami is?" They giggled and said, "Pilgrim, your search has ended." I wasn't surprised by this answer because I felt it was the truth. So as a young boy, 18 years old, he had opted not to go to college. He wanted to start his profession as a musician and check out the hip scene down in the village in Lower East Side. When he came to Matchless Gifts for the first time, a big change was going to occur in his life. So he had many questions after studying Bhagavad-Gita throughout his childhood and practicing hatha yoga. And some of his questions were very deep because he knew slokas from the Bhagavad-Gita. You can read his book. I didn't want to make the class too long about all the questions that he asked, particular slokas. And Prabhupada, he answered these were questions that had been searing in his mind for years and nobody could give him the answers about how Krishna can be both within and without and things that, the types of questions that devotees would ask. And Prabhupada, very matter-of-factly, he would say, turn to this sloka, read this sloka, try to understand it. Prabhupada answered all of his life questions in about 5 minutes. So Chuck said, Swamiji answered all of his questions about Bhagavad-Gita. And Chuck thought, do you know what just happened in there? Do you know what he just did? He gave me the answers to the most cosmic, theological, universal, eternal questions ever asked. And like it was just matter of fact. Then he thanks me for asking. I got to tell people about this so that Prabhupada, he was so used to young people coming to him with completely silly questions. One time a girl raised her hand and she said, Swamiji, whenever I chant, I see a red light. And Prabhupada said to her, that's all right. You'll be okay. It'll go away soon. And then another one said, I feel a lotus opening up in my brain when I chant. So they didn't understand the chanting. They didn't understand the philosophy. And here was a young boy coming, asking technical questions about the Bhagavad-Gita. Prabhupada was so happy to answer these questions that Prabhupada actually thanked him for asking the questions. So then Chuck asked Prabhupada, I took some of the paraphrasing out of this book and mixed it with Satsrup Maharaj's descriptions. So it's not exactly the full conversations. Chuck asked, where did you live in India? Vrindavan. What is it like? Oh, you can become more Krishna conscious in one day in Vrindavan than 10 years in America. One evening, the roof of Chuck's room caved in. So he went to 26 2nd Avenue and told the Swami what happened. So he describes in his book what happened. He had rented this little room to be near the temple. And all of a sudden he sees a crack in the ceiling and the plaster starts falling down. And he runs out of the room and then all of a sudden the entire ceiling falls down into the room. And he realized Krishna saved him. And the first thing he did was he went to Prabhupada and told him what happened. Krishna saved you, he said. Prabhupada said, can I sleep here tonight? Yes, just go downstairs. The boys will help you. One of the boys was Bruce. Bruce is Brahmananda. Prabhupada called them boys. They were powerful young men, you know. The Swami called him the mountain of our mission. Keith and Gregory also lived there. Keith was Kirtanananda and Gregory was Gargamuni. So this is before they all took initiation. And Chuck he has a wonderful sense of humor. He was telling some stories here about this first night when he slept there. That Prabhupada was giving an example about how we just flap around. We flap from one place to the other. And he was telling the story of Mrigrari and how he would leave the animals just flapping, half dead, until Narada Muni came and corrected him to at least kill them, completely kill them. Don't just leave them half dead. They're suffering so much flapping like that. So in the storefront at night, the rats used to come out. And the boys, they would just sleep on a thin mat, a little chatai. So sometimes the rats would run over them in their sleep. So Chuck was sleeping there next to Bruce and next to Greg and Keith. And all of a sudden, Bruce, he jumps up like, oh, must have been a rat. And Greg was his little brother, Gargamuni. What had happened was Greg was tickling him to make him think that it was a rat. And then Greg starts laughing. He says, oh, you were flapping. So even though they were very serious about hearing Prabhupada, they still had jokes with each other. So this was, Chuck immediately became part of the boys' club there, part of the family, staying there at the center. Steve Guarino, that's Satsrup Maharaj, the son of a New York fireman, had grown up in the city. He was a New Yorker. They were all New Yorkers. And graduated from Brooklyn College in 1961. Influenced by his father, he had gone into the Navy. He didn't want to go into the Navy, but his father encouraged, he more or less forced him to go into the Navy, where he had tolerated 2 years of military routine, always waiting for the day he would be free to join his friends on the Lower East Side. Finally, a few months after the death of President Kennedy, he had been honorably discharged. So, perhaps some of you have heard of President Kennedy, just as you had Mahatma Gandhi, and he was assassinated and created a great turmoil in the country. So we were all little kids then. President Kennedy was like our idol, the model American, trying to make things freer for people and civil rights, the equality of the black and white people. So many things went on at that time when Mr. Kennedy was the president. And then one communist shot him in the head while he was in a car, in a parade. And it caused a great turmoil in the country. And this was the time when he was discharged from the Navy, and he was able to join his friends there on the Lower East Side. Without so much as paying a visit to his parents, he had headed straight for the Lower East Side, which by then appeared vividly within his mind to be the most mystical place in the world. So, having endured 2 years in the military, where he had to undergo discipline, and fortunately, he was a writer, and he found out that they had a journal that the Navy used to publish. So he volunteered to write for that journal. So therefore, he didn't have to go into active military service with fighting and wars or anything like that. He even did writing work when he was in the Navy. But now that he was out, he was going to live the life he wanted to live. He was writing stories and short novels under the literary influence of Franz Kafka. We heard about Franz Kafka. He wrote some very significant books that influenced the younger people. I used to read Franz, in our classes in high school. We would have the textbook in front of us, and inside of the textbook I would have Franz Kafka's book, Thus Spake Zoroaster. I couldn't understand it. It didn't make any sense because it was completely atheistic, but it was the thing that young people read in those days because it wasn't the mainstream. It was something different from our American lifestyle. So he was under that same influence that most of us were, and he began to take LSD to search and experiment with consciousness. A Love Supreme, a record by John Coltrane, the jazz musician, encouraged Steve to think that God actually existed. So, along with literary pursuits, along with intoxication, along with free love and peace, there was the music scene. There were the Beatles, of course, there was the Rolling Stones, and there were jazz musicians. And from all this intoxication and freedom from the Judeo-Christian bonds of morality, especially from the intoxication, there were some realizations about God, the existence of God, not according to the mainstream religions, because most people saw them as hypocritical and not what they were looking for. It was what they were forced into from their childhood, so they rejected that. So this particular song, I've printed here the words because it's about God, actually. Love is a sacred word. Love is the name of God. The entire universe is created with love, by love, and in love. Love is the beginning, love is the continuation, and love is the end. That sounds quite Krishna conscious. All you have to add is instead of love, you write bhakti or love for Krishna. Love for lover's sake is divine. It's constructive, it's beautiful, It brings peace, it brings harmony, it brings joy to the lover and to the beloved. But if love is based on selfishness, egoism, the very same love brings destruction. Peace and harmony is based on love, and used properly by a selfless mind for the benefit of the humanity. Love knows no business. Love knows no bargain. Love never expects anything in return. Love knows only giving, 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 without even waiting for a thank you. Such a love is the supreme one. Let that love supreme reign all over the universe. So there was some beauty. Although they didn't know about Krishna yet, they understood actually the essence of Krishna consciousness, which is to love God, to love Krishna. So there were some benefits to breaking away from the constricts of the American culture and seeking a more spiritual and mystical way of life. And this song is an example of that. So Steve Guarino, though he had not yet met Prabhupada, he was being influenced by the writers, by the musicians. He was also expressing that in his writings. But he had to live. And to live in New York, it means you have to pay rent, you have to pay for electricity, just like anywhere else in the world. So just to make enough money to live, Steve had taken a job with the welfare office. One afternoon during his lunch hour, while walking down 2nd Avenue, he saw that the Matchless Gift Store had a small piece of paper in the window announcing Lectures in Bhagavad-Gita, A.C. Bhakti-Vedanta Swami. So about a few months ago, we had an 1.5-hour movie spoken by Satsvarup Das Goswami, and he explains that he described this day because every day he would walk down to First Street and 2nd Avenue. He would walk past the Matchless gift shops. Sometime he would look in the window and see what they were selling, little trinkets and little gift items. And then one day he saw that there was nothing. It was an empty window. Nothing was there except for the sign on top. And there was a little torn piece of paper down in the corner saying Lectures in Bhagavad-Gita, A.C. Bhakti-Vedanta Swami, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. Bruce and Chuck, unknown to one another, lived only 2 blocks apart. After the suggestion from his friend, so Bruce had a friend, because Bruce was, we'll read about it later, Bruce was very interested in Indian culture. His father, who was very wealthy, decided that Bruce should have an experience of the world. So he arranged for Bruce, Brahmananda, to work on a steamship liner. And that steamship liner took him to India. And he fell in love with India there. And he did everything Indian after that. He would eat Indian food, wear Indian clothes, read Indian books. And even when he went to college, he studied all the Indian philosophy as much as he could. He did his papers on the Bhagavad-Gita. He did his dissertations on Indian culture. So not only was he influenced by the Indian culture, but the people that he spoke to, the other students, and even his teachers, his professors, appreciated his Indophile. Indophile means he became an Indophile, lover of India. So one of his friends, Michael Green, he saw this note and he told Bruce about it, that, hey, there's a Swami down on Lower East Side right near where you live. Why don't you go check it out? So Bruce says, I was looking for Harekrishna. I had left my apartment and had walked over to Avenue B. Avenue B is because we're on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And after there's First Street, Second Street, Third Street, goes all the way on and on and on. All the streets that go this way from south to north. And then the avenues go from east to west. And before First Avenue, there's Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, Avenue D. They stop the numbers because everything is in grid. It was a pre-planned city, Manhattan. So I had walked over to Avenue B when I decided to walk all the way down to Houston Street. Houston Street is where Howard, Keith, and Wally lived. They had an apartment there. When I came to First Street, I turned right, and then, walking along First Street, came to Second Avenue. All along First Street, I was seeing these Puerto Rican grocery stores, and then there was one of those churches where everyone was standing up, singing loudly, and playing tambourines. They did singing also in some of the Christian churches. Then, as I walked further along First Street, I had the feeling that I was leaving the world. Like when you're going to the airport to catch a plane. I thought, now I'm leaving a part of me behind, and I'm going to something new. But when I got over to Second Avenue, I couldn't find Harekrishna. There was a gas station, and then I walked past a little storefront, but the only sign was one that said Matchless Gifts. Then I walked back again past the store, and then in the window, I saw a black and white sign announcing a Bhagavad-Gita lecture. I entered the storefront and saw a pile of shoes there. So I took off my shoes and came in and sat down near the back. Steve, I had a feeling that this was a group that was already established and had been meeting for a while. I came in and sat down on the floor, and a boy who said his name was Roy, he later became Ram Rai, one of Prabhupada's first disciples, was very courteous and friendly to me. He seemed to be one who had already experienced the meetings. He asked me my name, and I felt at ease. Kasturika. Can you run to the medical shop and get me a coughlette? Because I can't speak properly.
And water.
No, a coughlette. Those little lozenge.
Yes, can bring water also.
They have water here. It's okay. Hey, आपके पास? वो करेगी. Suddenly, Swami entered, coming through the side door. He was wearing a saffron dhoti, but no shirt, because this was August. It was very hot and muggy in New York with all the pollution. Just a piece of cloth like a long sash, tied in a knot across his right shoulder and leaving his arms, his left shoulder, and part of his chest bare. When I saw him, I thought of the Buddha. Bruce. There were about 15 people sitting on the floor. One man with a big beard sat up by the front on the right-hand side. That was Howard, or Hayagriva. He had a big beard, lots of hair. After some time, the door on the opposite side opened, and in walked the Swami. When he came in, he turned his head to see who was in his audience. And then he stared right at me. Our eyes met. This is Brahmananda speaking. Of course, Brahmananda was probably twice as big as everybody else in the whole audience, so naturally Prabhupada would have noticed him. It was as if he were studying me. In my mind, it was just like a photograph was being taken of Swamiji looking at me for the first time. Bruce. There was a pause. Then he very gracefully got up on the dais and sat down and took out a pair of hand cymbals and began a kirtan. The kirtan was the thing that most affected me. It was the best music I'd ever heard, and it had meaning. You could actually concentrate on it, and it gave you some joy to repeat the words, Hare Krishna. I immediately accepted it as a spiritual practice. So perhaps each one of us can remember the first time we chanted Hare Krishna and the effect that it had upon us. I remember I received a little mantra card, and it said on the top, chant these names of God and your life will be sublime. So I chanted it, and sure enough, as soon as you start chanting Hare Krishna, even if you don't understand what the words are, even if you're a little child, you have an experience because Krishna is none different from his names. So Bruce, he immediately experienced that this chanting had meaning. It wasn't just like chanting Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, mango, mango, because in the material world, the name of something is not the same as the object. But in the spiritual realm, Krishna's names are none different from him. So the Satchidananda identity of the Lord is present in his name as well. And the boys were feeling that as they chanted. Chuck, this is Achutananda. I entered the storefront and sitting on a grass mat, so that means, you see, we had read about 3 weeks ago that the boys from Mott Street, Houston and Mott, the three boys, Wally, Keith, and Howard, they decided, because Keith and Howard had already been to India, so they had some experience of how gurus lived, what they looked like, all the things like that. So they decided to secretly surprise Prabhupada, because Prabhupada was just sitting on a grass mat along with all the other audience. He wasn't sitting above them in any way. He was sitting at the same level as them. So they one day got together, they took the curtains from their house, they washed them, they dyed them purple, they got a rug, they built a platform, they made a seat, an asan for Prabhupada, they got pictures, they had collected so many posters from India, they didn't know what the posters were, they thought that Hanuman was a cat, and they had a picture of Sadbhuj. They had no idea who Sadbhuj was. Prabhupada liked that one very much. And some of them Prabhupada rejected. So they had decorated the whole room like that. And then when Prabhupada came in and saw what they had done, he complimented them that, oh, you're making advancement. So when Chuck came, he came before Steve and Bruce. Prabhupada was still sitting on a grass mat on the hard floor. He was a person who seemed at first to be neither male nor female. But when he looked at me, I couldn't even look him straight in the eyes. They were so brilliant and glistening. His skin was golden with rosy cheeks. Now, I don't think anyone here in this room, Sridham, he met Srila Prabhupada. I met Srila Prabhupada. And we can each remember the first second that we saw Srila Prabhupada. You remember? What was the first time that you saw Srila Prabhupada?
In 72, I see.
You saw Prabhupada in Delhi?
Delhi.
When he came to Bengali market? Wonderful. I saw Srila Prabhupada for the first time when he arrived at the New York airport. There were hundreds and hundreds of devotees chanting and dancing wildly at the airport. When Prabhupada walked out, we all hit the ground, we all offered our obeisances, And as soon as I picked up my head, the first thing I saw was Prabhupada's lotus feet, just walking towards us. So each one of us has our experience of the first time we saw Srila Prabhupada, and then afterwards building our relationship with Srila Prabhupada. So here, Achyutananda, he's describing his first impression of seeing Prabhupada. His skin was golden with rosy cheeks, and he had large ears that framed his face. He had 3 strands of beads. Prabhupada wore 3 strands. Now there's all types of fashions how you wear beads, but for initiated devotees, we wear 3 strands. And Prabhupada, he didn't transgress that. He also wore 3 strands. One which was at his neck, one a little longer, and the other down on his chest. He had a long forehead, which rose above his shining eyes, and there were many furrows in his brow. His arms were slender and long. His mouth was rich and full, and very dark and red and smiling, and his teeth were brighter than his eyes. So you can see here, Srila Prabhupada, when he smiled, his face was so brilliant. He sat in a cross-legged position that I had never seen before in any yoga book and had never seen any yogi perform. It was a sitting posture, but his right foot was crossed over the thigh and brought back beside his left hip. That means his right foot came all the way over, and this knee was on top of his left knee, so that his foot was already the way over here on his left hip. This is the closest picture I could find of that. This is Prabhupada taking massage right here in his garden. Hari Sori is giving him massage. So you can see a little bit, almost where Prabhupada has his knee coming to his left knee, and then his foot would go all the way to his left hip. His every expression and gesture was different from those of any other personality I had ever seen, and I sensed that they had meanings that I did not know, from a culture and a mood that were completely beyond this world. There was a mole on his side. You can see the mole there. And a peculiar callus on his ankle. So those of you who have joined Krishna consciousness, you might have noticed that because we sit so long cross-legged on the floor, on our ankle, we get a callus here. It just forms by itself because it's always leaning against the ground. It doesn't matter what we do, we can try to get rid of it, but it'll just keep forming again and again as a protection from our ankle against the floor. So these things were never visible in America before because nobody sits cross-legged in America. Only yogis sit like that. A round callus, similar to what a karate expert develops on his knuckle. He was dressed in unhemmed cloth, dyed saffron. So though Prabhupada had come to America, we'll read, hopefully we can get there today. No, there won't be time, but there is a funny description of when Brahmananda, before he met Prabhupada, he was going to the Ramakrishna mission there, the Vivekananda Society. And there, the Swami, who had begun this yoga society in 1933, many years earlier, he had a whole different approach to preaching in America. He wore a suit, and he had a haircut. He would eat meat and smoke cigarettes. And most of his followers were elderly women, widows. So here was Prabhupada. He didn't compromise one little bit. He was dressing exactly like a sannyasi. He didn't even have his shirt on. He just tied up his upper cloth against his shoulder, and You could see his back and his arms. He didn't even have his dhoti hemmed. It wasn't stitched. It was just torn cloth. And he would use the rock dye to make the color. So no one had ever seen anyone like Prabhupada before in America. Although yogis and gurus had come to America, all of them had compromised, thinking that unless I'm like the Americans, they'll see me as foreign and they won't accept me. But Prabhupada, he understood. He was bringing the message of Krishna consciousness. He came to give them knowledge, not that he had to compromise and follow what the Americans were doing. Everything about him was exotic, and his whole effulgence made him seem to be not even sitting in the room, but projected from some other place. So, when you're taking a lot of intoxication, especially powerful drugs like LSD, your vision sometimes becomes a little technicolor, and you see things in a very mystical way. He was so brilliant in color that it was like a technicolor movie, and yet he was right there. I heard him speaking. He was sitting right there before me. Yet it seemed that if I reached out to touch him, he wouldn't be there. At the same time, seeing him was not an abstract or subtle experience, but a most intense presence. After their first visit to the storefront, Chuck, Steve, and Bruce each got an opportunity to see the Swami upstairs in his apartment. So last week we heard about Bill Epstein, how he became Rabindra Sarup, but he considered it one of his services to Prabhupada to invite people to come to the storefront and send them up to meet Prabhupada upstairs in his room. So some of the boys who lived there, they might have been not fully dedicated to Prabhupada, not even able to follow the principles, but they were helping Prabhupada by sending other young interested people to meet him up in his room. Steve, I was on my lunch hour and had to be back in the office very soon. I was dressed in a summer business suit. I had planned it so that I had just enough time to go to the storefront and buy some books and then go to lunch and return to work. At the storefront, one of the Swami's followers said that I could go up and see the Swami. I went upstairs to his apartment and found him at his sitting place with a few boys. I must have interrupted what he was saying, but I asked him if I could purchase the 3 volumes of the Srimad Bhagavatam. One of the devotees produced the books from the closet opposite Prabhupada's seat. I handled the books. They were a very special color, not usually seen in America, a reddish natural earth, like a brick, and I asked him how much they cost. $6 each, he said. I took $20 out of my wallet and gave it to him. He seemed the only one to ask about the price of the books or give the money to, because none of the others came forward to represent him. They were just sitting back and listening to him speak. These books are commentaries on the scriptures, I asked, trying to show that I knew something about books. Swamiji said yes, they were his commentaries. Sitting, smiling, at ease, Swamiji was very attractive. He seemed very strong and healthy. When he smiled, all his teeth were beautiful, and his nostrils flared aristocratically. His face was full and powerful. He was wearing an Indian cloth robe, and as he sat cross-legged, his smooth-skinned legs were partly exposed. He wore no shirt, but the upper part of his body was wrapped in an Indian cloth shawl. His limbs were quite slender, but he had a protruding belly. When I saw that Swamiji was having to personally handle the sale of books, I did not want to bother him. I quickly asked him to please keep the change from my $20. I took the 3 volumes without any bag or wrapping and was standing, preparing to leave, when Swamiji said, "Sit down," and gestured that I should sit opposite him like the others. He had said sit down in a different tone of voice. It was a heavy tone and indicated that now the sale of the books was completed and I should sit with the others and listen to him speak. He was offering me an important invitation to become like one of the others, who I knew spent many hours with him during the day when I was usually at my job and not able to come. I envied their leisure in being able to learn so much from him and sit and talk intimately with him. So here is a picture of Satsvarup after he surrendered to Srila Prabhupada. He's shaven his head, he has a sika, he's dressed in dhoti and kurta, and he became the first secretary of the 26 Second Avenue Temple. Later, he was given much responsibility by Srila Prabhupada. He took sannyas in 1972, I believe. He was in charge of education, our Gurukula school in Dallas. He was a GBC. He became the editor of the Back to Godhead magazine for Srila Prabhupada for many, many years. And he preached all over the world. He would regularly become Srila Prabhupada's secretary for at least 1 month out of each year. He wrote a book called Life with the Spiritual Master. He wrote many, many books of poetry and also of prose about his times with Srila Prabhupada. And he was very instrumental in assisting Srila Prabhupada in the publication of his books. Prabhupada sent him to Boston to open a temple there. And there also he established the ISKCON Press, our first printing press where the first books were printed. And to this day, he's still serving Srila Prabhupada, giving lectures regularly despite poor health. So very early he became a disciple of Srila Prabhupada in the second initiation group, when Brahmananda, Kirtanananda, Satsvarup, and Achyutananda, they were all initiated together. By ending the sales transaction and asking me to sit, he assumed that I was in need of listening to him and that I had nothing better in the world to do than to stop everything else and hear him. But I was expected back at the office. I didn't want to argue, but I couldn't possibly stay. "I'm sorry, I have to go," I said definitely. "I'm only on my lunch hour." As I said this, I had already started to move for the door, and Swamiji responded by suddenly breaking into a wide smile and looking very charming and very happy. He seemed to appreciate that I was a working man, a young man on the go. I had not come by simply because I was unemployed and had nowhere to go and nothing to do. Approving of my energetic demeanor, he allowed me to take my leave. Satsvarup, after this, when he surrendered to Prabhupada, he used to give his entire paycheck to Srila Prabhupada to help with the preaching. Chuck. One of the devotees in the storefront invited me upstairs to see the Swami in private. I was led out of the storefront into a hallway and suddenly into a beautiful little garden with a picnic table, a bird bath, a bird house, and flower beds. After we passed through the garden, we came to a middle-class apartment building. We walked up the stairs and entered an apartment which was absolutely bare of any furniture, Just white walls and a parquet floor. Parquet it's wooden, something like this, but it's usually square pieces of wood. He led me through the front door and into another room, and there was the Swami, sitting in that same majestic spiritual presence on a thin cotton mat, which was covered by a cloth with little elephants printed on it, and leaning back on a pillow which stood against the wall. One night, Bruce walked home with Wally, and he told Wally about his interest in going to India and becoming a professor of Oriental literature. "Why go to India?" Wally asked. Wally became Umapati. "India has come here. Swamiji is teaching us these authentic things. Why go to India?" Bruce thought Wally made sense, so he resolved to give up his long-cherished idea of going to India, at least as long as he could go on visiting the Swami. So after Bruce graduated, he had planned to do his postgraduate studies here in India, and he got from the embassy, the Council of Education, a list of all of the universities and institutes that he could do postgraduate study here in India. And out of the list of hundreds of universities, one particular name stuck out to him, and that was the Oriental Institute here, Oriental Institute of Philosophy, that's right across the street from here. And he saw the word Vrindavan. So had he not met Srila Prabhupada, he would have probably come here. But by Krishna's grace, by his mercy, by his kindness, he sent Srila Prabhupada, picked up Bruce practically a month after Prabhupada moved into 26 2nd Avenue, and Brahmananda became one of Prabhupada's most powerful and stalwart followers. I have a few pictures here. The first one, that's when Brahmananda took sannyas in 1970. He was sent along with the three other sannyasis, Gargamuni, Vishnujan, and Subal Swamis. The four of them started traveling all over America and enlivening all the devotees with their Sankirtan. So here he is. He came back to New York. He had been the temple president there, both at 26 2nd Avenue, and then he arranged for the temple to move to a bigger place at 61 2nd Avenue, just down the street. And then Prabhupada in Mayapur, Prabhupada in Hawaii, Prabhupada in Los Angeles. Brahmananda was always with Prabhupada as much as possible. And he was very dear to Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada really liked it when Brahmananda was his secretary. He would call Brahmananda from his different GBC assignments, have him come all the way to travel with him all over the world. And sometimes Brahmananda said, when I leave, then all my GBC assignments get destroyed, and Prabhupada's calling me. Still, he would come to be with Prabhupada. So they had a very dear and loving relationship. His samadhi is here now in Vrindavan. He left this world here. Okay, we've gone over time, so we'll hear more next week. Hare Krishna. Jai.